Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined again today by Joshua Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. I detect a little more of a spring in your step.
Yeah, I think we just finished spring break, kind of in that final push to the end of the semester. Both my kids in school, we're obviously teaching a course together, and I can see the beginning of summer just over the horizon.
Yeah.
And I want it. I want it bad.
Yeah, no, a couple, even just to have a few more free weekends, would be, okay.
A little less foot traffic, just a little slower pace. I'll take the heat. It's fine. Yeah. Whatever. I'm ready. I'm ready.
So, today, we've been fairly focused topically, I think, for the last few podcasts that we've done.
I'm trying to think. It's a funny thing to say.
It is hard to remember.
Well, no, and it's just funny to hear you say, "Oh, well, we've been focused," and I'm like, "Oh boy, I don't know."
Well, I think I should put it this way: we've at least been thematic.
Yes, we've been thematic. I'll take
right.
that. All right.
But even then, we talked about the war. We talked in the impact of the war. We talked about the
there been some pretty deep dives and
some reasonably discrete topics. And, I think both as a reflection of the environment and the interest in it, today is, a day, I think, to look at kind of what are the signals out there in this interim election period that we're still in.
Right.
The election is still the underlying driving force here, allowing for, obviously, the, external shock, if you will, of the war in Iran.
Right.
I think we should probably just say the war in the Middle East now.
Right. Yeah.
And so I thought, we could look at a few of the signals in this interim election period where we're not, because of the runoffs and the high visibility runoff on the Republican side in the Senate race, we're not out of the primary season quite yet.
Right.
There's a Godfather 3 thing there. Every time we think we're out, they drag us back in. But also, in other ways, the general election is underway because most of the primary races are settled, et cetera, other, with the major exceptions. So I thought we could just kind of see what's stirring out there in terms of both the structural elements out there, campaign maneuvering that's going on in this transitional period between the primary and the general election campaigns, and kind of just think about what we're seeing out there. I think, we have to start, we've already kind of done this a little bit, but saying, there is a big thing going on. The war in Iran, its secondary, tertiary effects obviously have had a major impact on the context and what's going on. We did our segment yesterday for the intro level class I think we've mentioned them on here. We do this thing called Unpacking the News for the intro students that tries to talk about something going on in the current environment and tie it to content in the class. And we did the stuff on the war yesterday for this week's segment. And if people have, if you're teaching and you want to use this, I think we posted everything on the YouTube account.
Yeah.
So there's the Texas Politics Project YouTube account. Should be reasonably, it's probably not going to pop up in your marquee feeds, but
you're looking for a little freshman intro government.
I don't think the algo loves us that much, but it's easy to find if you just Google Texas Politics Project, or put Texas Politics Project in the search in the YouTube search window.
Can I ask you a question? I've been thinking about something as you're talking about this, and it is interesting in that, we'll get into this a little bit more, but, we do still in Texas, obviously, there's a foot in the primaries, as you said, and yet it does still feel like the next election is really just driving a lot. And I think, on the one hand, I was just sort of thinking about why that's the case. And we'll get to some specifics later. Because, obviously, in some ways, there's a long time to the election, right? We kind of talk about this all the time that, for people like us and people like you probably, you're paying a ton of attention. But for most people, like the real campaign, the real like focus on the races doesn't really start until after the summer, which we're not even in the summer yet. Summer's over the horizon. Right. And I wonder, if this, because, not I'm leaning on your longer experience here.
It's nicely put. Thank you.
But I wonder if this feels a little bit different right now, because it seems like it does. This almost always, not always, but historically in my experience here, after the primary is over, it's almost like there's like a lull. There's a little bit of a quiet period often.
People leave town.
And and like candidates usually aren't looking to spend a bunch of their money yet, that kind of thing. They're trying to raise money. And I wonder, if you do feel that like overall like the election is still kind of like driving a lot of the action, I'm thinking like the answer for like why that would be the case, and it seems to me it's like kind of the obvious answer for everything in some ways. Like, is it just Donald Trump? Is it just the fact that Democrats are so unified around the next thing they can do? And I'll add one more piece to that, and you can respond, which is, is it just Donald Trump? Is it also just the overall clear, just kind of like, I don't know, you can use any word you want here, degradation, ineffectiveness, whatever, of institutions to actually do something, right? So right now, there's all this stuff going on. There's concerns about prices. There's a war going on. And the institutions are essentially in this stasis in some ways, I'll say against the executive branch. Not against, but as contrary to the executive branch, which is just moving.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, is that sort of like why, in some ways for Democrats, like what else is there to focus on besides November? They've got very little, plays to make. Is that what you're thinking? I don't know.
Well, I guess I'm thinking when you first started talking about that, I was focused on the state.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking more about the national environment as a way of responding to this. I think nationally, your roundup of the usual suspects makes a lot of sense to me. That, and this gets us kind of into what we're talking about, which is, there's all these discrete things. There's, we'll hit, there's a lot of little things. And, we've got this kind of shopping list in the notes of things we can choose from. And that's all kind of out there. And I think that's the question I'm kind of wrestling with in my head, honestly, is at the national level, I think this usual. So at the national level, I think your roundup of the usual suspects is the right group of things to look at.
Yeah.
It is the continuing ability of Donald Trump to just drive the discussion,
right,
and to drive public attention. Although I think it's also in a slightly contradictory sense, a little bit of the degradation of his effectiveness in doing that.
Yeah.
In other words, and it's just, we talked about this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. We kicked around very tentatively this idea is, are the conditions and the effects of Trump's success and his position beginning to degrade a little around the edges?
I think so.
And how much? And we kind of decided yes, but sort of tentatively so. But I think in the 2 or 3, maybe 3 or 4 weeks since we had that discussion, in part because of the war, in part because of the shutdown of TSA.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a little more of that. And I think that is kind of part of the answer to your question.
I want to jump on something there real quick because I think it's a good opening for it. Like for me, I agree with you. And where I see that is not in the way that I think people would normally think to see that. Just to be really clear, it's not as though you're seeing a bunch of like Republican senators saying, hey, I don't know about this war.
Right.
You're not seeing any sort of, candidates and potential candidates on the Republican side creating a bunch of distance between themselves and Trump. But what I look at, and this is sort of what I was talking to a lot of reporters about last week, was, there was the deadline for either Paxton or anyone to drop out of the runoff, basically. Right. And there was a lot of questions last week from reporters about, is Trump going to, is he going to get involved? If he does, blah, 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 blah. And we talked a little bit about this already, and you all probably have a pretty good sense of it. Ultimately, he didn't endorse anybody. And, I keep kind of coming back to this thing, which is, you can learn a lot about, I think, the Trump administration and what Trump is seeing and hearing and thinking about by what he does or doesn't do. And in some ways, like my view of that is if he could have endorsed and it would have been effective, whether in the runoff, whether in the first primary, whether in getting somebody to drop out, he would have done it. And the point is that he didn't because it wouldn't have been. Paxton wouldn't have dropped out. Cornyn certainly wouldn't have dropped out. It was not going to be effective. So at the margins, to your point, it's already less effective. It's already the case that he's not able to go in and say, all right, listen, get out of here. Because you know what? Ken Paxton is going to run again for office probably after Trump is out of office. So is potentially John Cornyn. Maybe not John Cornyn. Probably not John Cornyn. But a lot of these people are. And so that sort of hold in that power. And I think the thing that's sort of useful about Trump is he's not going to expose himself, right, in that way. Like, he's not going to go and do something that'd be
not in this context.
Not in this context, and be seen as ineffective. I said that was a little that was a little setup.
Thank you.
But I think that's part of what I'm looking at now. It's not so much like what's right in front of your face. It's almost like, well, what's not happening? And, and that's where I'm sort of seeing the edges of this a little bit. His sort of command and control over everybody is starting to loosen a little bit.
Right. And just a little, but enough, enough to have an impact. So I think in terms of, the way you initially posed that, I also think then to look at Texas, I think the other reason that there's a little bit more, these stirrings of maybe earlier attention than usual, is because of the focus and the visibility and the national attention on the Senate race.
Yeah, and the money. I mean, just to say
it's going to recede.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the money kind of is baked into that, I think, or, helps drive that. But that has receded some, but it's still, I think, maybe a slightly different version of this. And I was thinking about how to raise this before we came in here. I mean, I do feel like I'm having a lot more casual conversations outside of the usual suspects with people about the election.
Absolutely.
And in Texas, it's mainly the Senate race.
That's my experience too.
Yeah. And so I don't want to go too far with that, because even outside of my, our usual social circles are not, it's not that broad.
I go hang out on the job site all the time.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, one wants to be measured about that.
Right.
But I mean, so I think that's, to me, that's what we're trying to figure out here. I mean, I thought we just talk about a few of the things going on, and, it's kind of a pointillist approach, or maybe, less pretentiously, just a vibe check.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about a couple of things. So, I mean, let's look a little bit at kind of what's going on. I mean, we've talked about this. I mean, I think the way you can kind of divide this is, what's kind of more forward-looking in the way that we're talking about, in which the general election campaign is beginning.
Yeah.
The environment is really about that.
Right.
Or there's a general election campaign environment, and then there's the lingering kind of effects of the primary, or something that's still a little more rooted in that. Let's start with like the kind of expected one, the one that movement we would expect in the direction of general election competition between the two parties. And one of the things I think that's worth pointing out is that in the last couple of weeks, we have seen some Republican groups already working on softening up James Talarico.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he has a pretty, extensive record of comments and various things that obviously have been combed through and, pulled apart for various, partisan reasons. And that's, I think, to be expected. I mean, whatever. That's everybody who runs for office knows that's going to happen. I think the question that I have, from where I'm sitting, is it too early? And I mean, and again, this goes back to kind of normal operating procedures. James Talarico might be well known among Democrats, and I think the idea now is to drive up his negatives among Republicans, obviously, and that makes sense. But as we were talking about, I wonder, I guess, I mean, I'll say this. On the one hand, I don't think they want a better O'Rourke situation where they kind of sit on it. They kind of let this guy build up his name ID, build up goodwill, build up his, brand among independents. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we've got a problem on our hands. Right. So I think they've learned from that. At the same time, there is this sort of other thing where, generally campaigns are a little reluctant to do anything to raise the name ID of their opponents. And again, these aren't the campaigns. These are other groups who are spending this kind of money. But you do kind of wonder, I wonder, is this too early? And this is, you've got an Oppo file, you want to dump it. Do you want to dump it now? Or do you want to dump it again when more people are paying attention more regularly to this kind of stuff? I think it's an open question. It's a strategic question. I mean, in some ways, once you've said it and it's out there, like it's out there, okay, he responds and moves on. Like, we talked about this last spring or whatever.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that it's an interesting comparison to what we've seen on the Republican side. I think what we've been talking about, in some ways for a few years now, since the Paxton impeachment. Yeah. Which is, at a certain level, Ken Paxton's political viability reflects the fact that a lot of negative information is out there. Yeah. And it's baked in.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I think to your observation about that, the question is, could the attacks on the efforts to soften Talarico up, as I've said, fall into that trap where by the time you get to the general election, people feel like it's old news. Like, yeah, when he was a state legislator, said there were 6 genders, or whatever all of this Oppo research stuff is. And I don't know. And I think there's another element of that I want to put a pin in for a minute. But I think the interesting thing about this is that it does speak to the tension at the heart of the Talarico candidacy and the Talarico brand that we talked about a little bit during the primary, but that is now
a little bit
in more full flower, which is, on one hand, you've got this argument that, hey, James Talarico is this kind of fits the mold of a young, progressive, white Democratic candidate, but that also has mainstream appeal. The sharp part of that, obviously, was the racial component of that during the Crockett-Talarico competition. But that, clearly the brand of the Christianity, we were kind of poking at this when we did that look at religious views of him. That's kind of why I wanted to do that.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of thing where you've got this guy that can not alienate the progressive wing of the party and this drive for to move the party to the left.
Yeah.
But also the kind of argument that he still has appeal to non-democratic constituencies.
Yeah.
And that was just lurking during the primary. Now that these attacks are being launched by the other party, I think that lays bare that challenge for the Talarico campaign.
Yeah.
Which is, how do you respond to that, and how do you square that circle?
Yeah, I was thinking,
or circle that square.
Sort of two things. Is one, I thought you were going to go somewhere else at the beginning, actually, so I'll hit that one first, actually, which is, in some ways, if Paxton becomes the nominee, the Oppo research file on Paxton is pretty deep, right? And, we can have, a more sophisticated discussion, not today or whatever, about, how much of that information has really made its way out, into the electorate. I think that's something of an open question. But if you're Republicans looking to maintain that seat in Republican hands, and you think that there's look, right now, 50-50 chance, let's say, that Paxton's the nominee, and I think that's probably a relatively, I could probably think a little bit more about that, but I think that's where we are. Then, if nothing else, it seems that it's probably valuable to muddy the water as much as you can. Because if, there's two problems. I mean, there's a problem that Paxton has vis-a-vis Talarico, and then there's a problem that Talarico has vis-a-vis Talarico, I think. The problem that Paxton has vis-a-vis Talarico is that Paxton's, base of support has often been tied to his conservative credentials, his leaning into religion, and then all the negative Oppo research going to come out is going to put a dent on a lot of that.
Well, look, I would say this. The way that they, we should say this because it kind of follows on the other point. I think it follows where you're going, which is the other side of saying that a lot of the negative aspects of Paxton's candidacy and Paxton as a person and a candidate have already been baked in among people. The other side of that is that it's been baked in with the help of a trope in the Republican Party that the liberal press, the haters, just want to drag down everybody like they tried to drag down President Trump.
Right.
And I think highlighting that mechanism, I think, is kind of important.
Yeah.
Because it's not ideological. It's not so much it's another dimension.
Yeah, and I think it gives, and if you can imagine a debate where something comes up along kind of a moral, ethical dimension, and it gives Paxton more, Paxton potentially, or Cornyn really, more avenues to deny Talarico a potential high ground. Now, I think Talarico also has a challenge here because, I'm trying to figure this out. Someone is, people have been asking me about this more and more, and you already laid this out. For all this focus on his religion, he's a pretty standard progressive candidate. If you look at his policy positions on it, it's not as though, people have asked me, are there places where his religion clearly takes him into a different place than we would expect a Democrat to go? And the answer is, well, not really.
Well, right. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, and I think that is part of that contradiction I was talking about, right? Which it's one end to go, hey, he can talk about Christianity. It's like, yeah, but the way he talks about Christianity does not have universal appeal.
Right.
Period.
Yeah, and so I think this is, I think this is all...
And all of that is coming out right now.
Yeah, so I think now that we've had this discussion, I'd say, it's probably not too early given the constellation we're talking about, given the fact that, look, the one thing that's going to go on the Republican side is they're going to continue to tear each other down. So long as Cornyn is spending a bunch of money tearing down Paxton and Paxton spending less money comparatively trying to tear down Cornyn, having another line of messaging out there that's about this other person who's definitely going to be in the race, it seems like probably a good investment.
I think that's right. I mean,
even if a little early.
And just from a pure tactical position, I could see people sitting around, you know what? Their primary is resolved. There's probably a presumption of the same kind of dynamic that we were referring to, that our gut feeling is, okay, primary's over, let's take a breather. Mm-hmm. And one way to sort of vector off of the disadvantage that Republicans now have because they have to manage this runoff, say, well, let's not waste this time.
Yeah, let's not take our eye off the ball here.
Let's go ahead and launch a few salvos here and keep them occupied.
Yeah.
And make them do some things, and so there's a real tactical, I think, possibility here.
Yeah.
And also from the to the extent that outside groups are doing this, I mean, I from a kind of impressionistic, gossipy perspective, it's kind of willing. Paxton campaign does not want to spend a lot of money.
Yeah, they don't have a lot of money.
They don't have a lot of money. They don't want to spend it. And so there are reasons for this. But I think the thing that I really am kind of thinking about is kind of the overall point here is that this is going to be an interesting early test for the Talarico campaign.
Yeah.
And to see how they respond to this. So, I think another thing that we're seeing in the kind of general election environment, and this is definitely a bit more pointillist, but also I think kind of one of the, something that really kind of preoccupied people for a couple of days this week and, in Austin, and that is kind of stirrings in the ledge as indicated, first and foremost by the announcement of committee chair assignments by Lieutenant Governor Patrick and committee assignments, and then, the dust up that occurred because he did not assign Taylor Remmett, the Democrat who carried out this, pulled off the surprise win in SD9, the Hancock seat. They didn't put him on committees, and that resulted in a bit of back and forth between the lieutenant governor and Senator Remmett.
Yeah. How unusual! So,
I think one can make too much of this.
Yeah,
but it's out there, and it is a sign that there is a lot of attention to the general. There's some attention to general election environment going on here. You just unpack it reasonably a little bit. Just the argument that Lieutenant Governor Patrick made, not quite an institutional argument per se, is that, look, this guy's not going to win. That's a Republican district. This is a fluke. I'm not going to bother.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting position to take. And
then the Remmett was going, hey, I was duly elected. You're depriving the people of SD9 of a representative, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, that's look, I don't think it makes a difference, but I'm sure whoever ends up being the Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor is happy that this has happened in some ways. I mean, not for Taylor Remmett, because, ultimately these are interim committees, I'm kind of throwing my hands up. Yeah, okay.
Right.
We can make more of this than it needs to be made of, but the idea that, Dan Patrick is going to spend, however many millions of dollars or direct however many millions of dollars to try to defeat this person in a special election, fail, and be like, I'm just not really going to let you represent anybody right now. I don't know. I don't know if that's a good look. I mean, I'll just say, I just don't think that that's, for someone who's been in the institution as long as he has in the position that he's been in, I don't think it's a good look for using your power, but does it matter? Probably not.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I guess what I would, my response to that would be, and I'm sure this is part
it's
of
a vibe check. We're doing vibe checks right now.
Good luck for to whom?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is, to use the metaphor locally, this is an inside the Beltway story crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
But if anything, it might give, you were talking about, it might give about the lieutenant governor's race. It gives Remitt something else to talk about.
Yeah.
In the campaign to hang on to that seat.
Yeah, he gets to run as the person Dan Patrick doesn't want in the Texas Senate, which I think is, that's probably not a bad.
He's not being posed as, as opponent of Lieutenant Governor on Colbert or anything. So,
right.
There's a limited return on it.
Right.
But it's there. I think that's right. And then I think, the other thing I kind of noticed out there another thing I kind of noticed out there in the ether that is not so much about party competition, but the fact that there does seem to be some falling back on the effort to do away with voting centers at the county level in a couple of these places after the debacle in Dallas.
Yeah. And Williamson, that's true. And Williamson County's also has same.
Say that again?
Williamson County had similar problems.
Right. And so, and I think it's Williamson that has said they're going back to voting centers. Right?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
And so, that's an interesting, bit of general election fodder out there, because I do expect, and I suspect you do, certainly at the national level, voting and election practices are very much in the mix,
right?
Because of President Trump's push for Congress.
Well, this is
to pass national restrictions on voting and et cetera, et cetera.
This is a super interesting story in some ways, and it's probably almost underappreciated in a lot of senses. To the point that you're making, in the sense that, like, right now, to the the interesting intersection of Texas politics and national politics, or one of them is the SAVE Act, right? In the way that, we talked about this last week, the way that Paxton tried to use, sort of his whatever, leverage he felt like he had over whomever to try to force passage of the SAVE Act in the U.S. Senate. And I think what's interesting about this is, this is a really good example of how what seems like maybe reasonable, changes to election practices can have really big consequences. And the gist here, just for people who, I think, I'm gathering all of a sudden that we have some listeners outside of Texas. So just real quick, early voting in Texas is about 2 weeks. During early voting, you can vote in anywhere in, you basically, your voting area, right? Your city, wherever it is, wherever the county, that's what it is. And whatever the county is, any voting location. If both parties agree on election day, you can also vote anywhere in the county if they agree to countywide voting.
Right.
Now, if the parties disagree that they're not going to cooperate, then on election day, everybody has to vote in the precinct they are assigned based on, basically the voter registration.
Kind of, and look, supporters of this will say that's the way we've done it for most of the country's history, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of those sort of, I put this in quotes, common sense arguments.
Right. Like voter ID.
Yeah. That just sort of you say, oh, okay. Yeah, sure. That's how we used to do it. The problem is, and this is the problem in Dallas, and it was the problem in Williamson, and it was the problem for both Democrats and Republicans, was that if they're used to voting wherever is convenient on the way to work, after dropping their kid off at school, whatever, well, now they either have to drive to some other part of town or just not vote.
Right.
And I'll tell you what, in a primary election, those are some engaged people usually, more engaged than average. And you know what? They're pretty pissed if they have to drive, to some other part of town because somebody decided something that they just honestly we're not paying any attention to, because nobody pays attention to this kind of stuff.
And look, anybody who's voted on election day knows that it gets more crowded at the end of the day.
Gets more crowded at the end of the day.
Morning and then the end of the day.
Right. And so I think this is one of those interesting things where it's kind of like, we're going to count everything by we're going to do paper ballots. We're going to count everything. And there have been a couple little attempts and, sort of, I would say, flirtations with that here. And they've been kind of disastrous. And so this is the whole thing. We can, sort of think that these common sense things, this is the way everybody used to do it. We should change federal voting rules so that they say this. And this is to say, this was like a relatively minor change, and it was like a pretty big problem. It was swiftly addressed by the public, and the parties have responded pretty swiftly. It's like, well, we're not doing that again. Our bad. Right. But if you say like 6 months ago, was anybody in the decision making really acknowledging the possibility of problems with this, even though they were pretty foreseeable? No. But here we are.
I think when I would disagree only slightly with that, in the sense that there are people that would tell you, mostly Democrats, but also some Republicans who are trying to be discreet about it.
Yeah.
Like, this is not going to lead to a clear partisan advantage from the Republican side on the Democratic side. So this is going to cause problems.
I guess I would say is there's just not a lot of incentive for many Republicans to say, geez, paper ballots? I don't know.
Well, and that's why I think it wasn't more decisively, nipped in the bud.
Right.
But I mean, so I think all that is going on, and the broad point here is it's time to start watching that stuff again.
Yeah,
I guess,
for sure.
Oversimplified point, but
I think so. I mean, I think this is the ongoing discussion. I think
to your point that these things get made and people are quibbling about them and they seem technical and they seem marginal marginal and or common sense. And there are always some people either loudly on the Democratic side usually going, no, but also on the Republican side going, well, are we sure we want to do that? And it's time to start watching all that stuff again.
Well, it's really interesting just because if you think about the one from last time, it was, well, if you're going to do a mail-in ballot, you need to make sure that you provide us with your driver's license or social security number, whichever one you used when you applied to vote in Texas. And again, speaking of who's the one using mail-in ballots, well, mostly people over 65. Maybe they don't remember when they registered to vote what they used. And so, these sorts of things are like, they seem like these small things, but then ultimately they don't necessarily provide a partisan advantage. They sow more distrust in the system. And to your point, that's why they're very important to start keeping an eye on, because there's I think there's obviously been an incentive to sow distrust in the system. It continues. And honestly, some of the actions that have been framed to create more trust in the system might actually be having the opposite consequence.
Yeah, I think that's an utterly fair proposition.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so let's, then look back before we get out of here on just a few of the lingering effects of the intra-party tensions that were surfaced by the primaries.
Yeah.
I would say especially more on the Republican side than on the Democratic side, although we kind of backed into something on the Democratic side in talking about some of the lingering tensions around James Talarico. I think I did a panel for Pat right after the election, and Gromer Jeffers Jr., friend of the podcast and the project and longtime Dallas reporter, and I asked him on that panel as a follow-up how serious he thought the lingering anger, negative energy on a racial basis over the all-red Talarico dust-up were in the Dallas area. And, he thought that they were there.
Yeah.
That he said, I think Gromer, he pitched it at kind of an intermediate level, if you will. I mean, in other words, it's very Gromer.
Yeah, I was going to say,
it sounds careful,
like Gromer.
He was careful but direct in saying, it's not a huge problem, but there are some things that have to be dealt with there. That's to paraphrase what he said. So, that's there too. But there's been some pretty, high-profile rock throwing in the Republican Party in the last few days. I think thing that is probably I was mentioning, the insider attention on the Patrick move on committees and the Remit thing, but the thing that got the most attention was this rock throwing between Attorney General Paxton and Acting Comptroller Kelly Hancock. The Comptroller is conducting an audit of the AG's office, sent them what I would call the classic strongly worded letter.
Yeah, I love a strongly worded letter.
With a lot of with some pretty sharp barbs in it, aimed at the Attorney General, and as most people in Texas will remember, but if you're not following this as closely, remember Hancock was somebody who voted to convict Paxton.
Yeah.
In the wake of the impeachment. Obviously, neither has forgotten that.
Yeah.
And Attorney General Paxton is attached, the Comptroller, I can't remember, I don't have it right in front of me, used some pretty nasty, personal language. But this has also has some other secondary effects having to do with Greg Abbott's support for Hancock.
So I was going to ask you.
Scott Braddock at Quorum Report had a pretty good post on Quorum Report, unpacking some of, it was a good reminder of the history there, I would say.
Yeah, I agree.
And how that all, unfolded, what the backstory is on this. But that has been pretty rude and has brought out a lot of things, I think, secondary things. Again, no news about Ken Paxton there.
No.
Right, either in his approach to this or the criticisms or the divisions and the opposition that he's generated in some corners of the party. But it also kind of dragged Governor Abbott into this in an interesting way because it underlines the degree to which, I'm trying to think about how diplomatic I should be here.
I'm watching.
That Hancock was, kind of a weak sister as a candidate for comptroller. Both from the time that he was installed in the office and Scott Braddock's piece reminded pretty pointedly about the constitutional backflips that had to happen to appoint Hancock without getting into all the details, because he was a seated senator at the time. Constitution, prevented him from taking, being appointed to an executive office. So they made him chief of staff. And then once he was chief of staff, the governor, in a somewhat improvised exercise in nominalism, then declared him acting comptroller shortly thereafter. Braddock was pretty negative about that. And the governor did take some heat on that, having to do with, that drew a little bit of attention, I think, to the difficulty they had in filling that spot once Glenn Hager decided he was going to go take the other gig. Anyway, we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but this contention between Paxton, Hancock, the illustration that there is some friction with the governor there, is all very interesting and, not the kind of thing you want really floating out there. And obviously the other thing floating out there is just to complete the circle so it's clear, what Paxton did was criticize Hancock on a number of counts, and then in response to this audit, and then urged the governor, to basically get rid of Hancock, and hey, you might as well just appoint James Huffines now, or Don Huffines now.
Yeah.
Which, again, to step back on this, I will say this.
That's really...
Whatever you think of Ken Paxton.
Yeah.
The guy has shown some political, the guy and his team have shown some pretty sharp political instincts. If you go back a few weeks to the move you mentioned in terms of saying he would drop out of the race if the Senate did all these things the Senate's not going to do.
Right.
This was also, I think, a pretty,
to me,
pretty good shiv.
And I hadn't heard all that stuff because I had a question, but I think
you've
kind of done it. You've by squaring the circle, you've done it for me because I'm sitting here, I'm thinking to myself, and I'm just going to say real quick, just speculating on some things here. I'm just thinking about some things that I've been saying and thinking about that I think attached to this, which is, and hearing all that. My first question is sort of like, well, how much, in principal agent terms, how much is Abbott directing Hancock's efforts towards the AG's office is a question, or is involved, or where, or whatever, right? And we just don't know.
We don't know, but what we do know is that it is a pretty known fact that the governor exerts a lot of command and control over the executive branch, allowing for the, plural executive, yada, yada.
Yeah, and then there's two interesting things to that. So before getting to the second part with Paxton and the response, which I love, by the way, is just watch Observer Politics, golf clap for that one. But basically, it seems to me that when I'm thinking, what's the argument for Abbott here? Regardless of like bedfellows, allies, whatever, it's like, what I keep telling a lot of people is that the sort of one of the big overarching factors in this election coming up, outside of all the the big currents that we're talking about, the other thing that I always say to people is, you got to remember, Abbott has $100 million.
Yeah,
he has a lot of flexibility. He spends
counting.
He spends it in a very sophisticated manner. And if he's looking at his war chest right now, and he's thinking what a lot of I would say insider Republicans are thinking, which is Ken Paxton's going to need a lot of money and is going to need a lot of assistance potentially.
And he's going to create the need for more money down ballot.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And then who's the person who fills that in? Well, that's Abbott. There's nobody, that's Abbott's job at this point. He's the leader of the party here, and I think people know that. I mean, in some ways, he put himself in this position.
Well, no, that's the instrument. He has used his financial prowess as an instrument of authority and control of the party.
So I'd be reluctant just because I don't know enough to say, well, yeah, it would make sense for Abbott to be like, yeah, let's throw some shade over there. But then in some ways, Paxton's response almost confirms it because like, hey, you know what? Why don't you just appoint the guy who ran against you before, who you really don't want? And also you endorsed somebody else. You appointed somebody else. You clearly don't want this person as the comptroller. Why don't you appoint him now?
Yeah.
He won. Just do it.
And in terms of, how we're having this discussion about the lingering tensions of primary politics, you don't see people rub the governor's nose in it quite so explicitly as that.
No.
I mean, saying, hey, why don't you just appoint Don Huffines, as you're saying, that's pretty much,
And again, I'll reiterate the point we made last week, which I got from a reporter, which is that the one thing about Huffines is he is not beholden to Abbott.
Yeah.
He doesn't need Abbott's money, and he's going to do what he's going to do. So in terms of as a deal for Abbott, it's a terrible deal.
Yeah.
So
and it was in the Braddock piece that there was there's lingering. I think it was something else. It might have been a Harvey piece of crumb at Quorum Report. And forgive me, guys, I'm not keeping things straight here, but there is a degree to which there is always been concern, and it's of course more acute now that the primary has happened, that Huffines will not be somebody that the governor can manage, that will not be somebody who is going to play it the way that, for example, Glenn Hager played it.
Right.
Which was, much more subtle, and you don't think subtle when you think Don Huffines.
No.
Right.
Not the
you summarize it that
not
way.
It.
So, before we get out, and we've gone longer than we were going to, of course, but I think that, I've got something that is partly about the emergence from the primary, but also about the primary, reflects the primary, but also is about the general election. And I think, as we're, again, stepping back and thinking about what we're seeing out there in the environment and things that are tentative signs of something, we are seeing, I think, a certain amount of trial balloons, or I'm not sure if it's even that, but these steps towards figuring out how Republicans are going to campaign in a way that mobilizes their base, but manages the things that have to be avoided because of the gravitational force exerted by Donald Trump and what you can and can't campaign on in relation to him.
Right.
Mainly, in other words, to put it a little too simply, what are you going to talk about that's not in order to not talk about the economy?
Yeah.
Right. And so, we've seen signs that Republicans are going to try to reconfigure the politics of immigration and their connection with cultural identity again.
I think this is...
And little things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and this goes back to the Abbott point and who's making decisions about what. A seemingly obscure story. I mean, hats off to the Texas Tribune for covering this. This decision that, if you're going to seek a professional license in Texas, the Commission on License and Regulation earlier this week adopted a new rule that said that you have to produce proof of citizenship before you can get licensed in Texas.
Brilliant move.
Yeah, I mean, and taps directly into these kinds of politics in a way that recognize the kind of evolution or development on that front that we've talked about in here a lot, in the recalibration of how you mix in border security, which has receded as an issue on its own, and immigration.
Well, I think this is even better than that, because in some ways this also touches on the economic element, right? Yeah. Because ultimately, what are Democrats going to argue? No, we should be giving professional licenses to undocumented workers, and then the Republicans will say, "Oh, so what? You don't think those jobs should go to Texans?" Or whatever.
We also have to remember, but proof of citizenship is, we'll see what they
we'll see what they come up with, because
what they mean by that,
Yeah, no, I mean, it is one of these things. It's like, and again, the whole I hate the word. I hate when people say common sense in politics, because it's just almost always misused.
You got to reach for your wallet.
Oh, yeah. Well, but that's the whole thing. It's like, well, this is common sense. And it's like, hey, where's your original birth certificate? Where is it? No, right now. Do you know? I mean, and most people would say, oh, some people know. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not the case, but this is for a lot of people. And especially a lot of, even just not even old people, just like middle-aged people, like just a lot of people, they don't have these documents all the time. Right. It doesn't mean they're not citizens, whatever. So this is another one of unintended consequences, but to the point, this is a way to talk about immigration. This is a way to tie it to, potentially economic distress.
Right.
And,
that's a good point.
And it's a way to do it that doesn't criticize the president in any way, and it's in an area that they have complete control over. And I'll say, if you ever go and go into some of the Texas, go into some websites in Texas government, there are a lot of regulated industries that require licenses.
Oh, yeah.
It's a huge list if you ever go look for it. And I mean, so just to say, this is not like a small-ish thing. It is, kind of.
The excerpt in the lead in the Tribune story said from electricians to dog breeders, and there's a lot in between there.
There's a lot in between electricians.
And so I think the other thing, so there, a little bit of a data point on.
Yeah. Well, we're looking to see how they're going to do this. This is the thing we've been talking about a lot, is that because of Donald Trump's success on the issue and his approach to politics, Republicans can't talk about undocumented immigrants and gangs crossing the border. Are we going to see all the advertisements about the South American gangs infiltrating Texas right now? Probably not. So we need to see what this is a first effort in what does this look like? How do they bring immigration back into the campaign space and talk about it in a way that's in their control? It's not critical of the president. This is an interesting first move.
And I think, adjacent to that then is another thing that we had talked about and we wanted to hit, which is the evolution of the anti-Muslim discourse in the Republican Party and the tactics around all the we talked a lot about the campaign trope of fighting against and preventing Sharia law and how that popped up in some odd places during the primary and the ads, but frequently and was clearly, if not coordinated, seeded messaging that got it. We got into a lot of nooks and crannies in the Republican primary, and how that is now going to interact with the war in Iran.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, there's one thing, we had a piece way back during Trump's first run for office, and it was after a terrorist attack in France.
Right.
And one of the things that, was going on at that point in time was, Donald Trump's language towards undocumented immigrants, towards various people, was still evolving and developing. And he was in some ways more, this wasn't quote, more of a normal politician at that point in time. I mean, he wasn't ever, but he wasn't necessarily as
it felt a little more familiar.
Yeah, he wasn't feeling his oats like he does now, going out there doing whatever he's, trusting his instincts as much. And one of the things was when he was really, sort of post, Mitt Romney autopsy. How's the Republican Party going to move forward? And Donald Trump was talking about rapists and murderers and all that stuff. And there was a real discussion going on at that time, hey, is this going to work for the Republican Party? And then one of the things that happened after that terrorist attack in France was the conversation shifted more towards, Muslims. What about, these people coming from the country? They're terrorists coming across the southern border. And that's when that kind of trope started coming up a lot more often. Not that it hadn't come up before, but more frequently. And so there is I think it's something to keep an eye on again. Just like, this sort of, how do we get immigration back in? There's been a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric during the primaries. Now we're at war with Iran.
It's central, and it's, to tie things together a little bit. And it's one of the themes in the Paxton Hancock dust up. And it's something that the Cornyn campaign is hitting Paxton on.
And so it's going to be,
it's not the Cornyn campaign. I think it's the allied groups that are running those ads.
It's something to keep an eye on. And I think just like, and what, you said something before about, in terms of the Republicans are focused on mobilizing their base, but they're also really focused on keeping the Democrats in a defensive position. And this is something of a great sense. Because again, if you think number one, okay, so Democrats have to argue that, people shouldn't have to provide, proof of citizenship to work here and have a license for a profession.
Yeah.
That's going to be a tough one. Honestly, it's tough to find a lot of allies for Muslims because there aren't a lot of Muslims in Texas to begin with. And for Democrats, you have to decide whether you want to try to protect Muslims generally, whether you want to talk about civil rights generally or human rights generally, and whether that's worthwhile. And then the other issue that, has been coming up increasingly, especially from the president, is trying to sort of re-raise the issue of the existence of transgender people and transgender rights. And again, this is one of those things where I don't think this is a huge general election issue, but it's an issue that Democrats have had a horrible time addressing. And they really, as a party, don't know how to address it. And part of the challenge here is that not only do they not know how to address it, but there's no unified message. So in some sense, any Democrat is responsible for every Democrat on a lot of these issues. And that's been where they've been.
That's a good way of putting it.
And they've been really challenged with this. And so I think, even if you're James Talarico and you don't want to talk about, transgender issues, if there's a, Democratic, candidate somewhere else in the state or another statewide candidate somewhere else who says something that's a little bit further out maybe than a Democrat said before, now it's like, well, what do you think?
Yeah.
Right? And now either they have to respond or not. And I think this is sort of what we're seeing as the shift to the general election. Is how do you keep Democrats on the defensive?
And our state polling has shown that is a good issue.
That's a good issue for them.
For Republicans, because on some of the particular issues that Republicans have pushed on this issue, two in particular, treatment of minors and sports.
Yeah.
And there was
I saw that too.
My notes are not good enough, but there's a good national report on this that we'll put on our website with the post for this podcast.
Are you talking about the polling that the Democrats have basically done? They basically acknowledge, these are bad spots for us.
Right. We are not, the public is not, to the extent that we are going, these are not areas where if we are going to be committed to the rights of transgender people, we should not be fighting on these fronts. We should be doing it a different way.
Right.
And it's it's by design, it puts Democrats in a difficult internal political position moving into the general, because you've got strategists kind of saying, look, having to say we're not abandoning this constituency or their broader allyship in the progressive wing of the party, but we have to have a serious, pragmatic conversation about, what hills we're going to die on.
Right. Right. And that's really what the conversation is.
And it is. And so that is also that is part of what's going on in the Democratic side. And on, then the flip side of that that is being, that's being poked at by Republicans right now pretty hard in a way that has been a little bit in abeyance.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it ever completely went away, and in some ways it had been ramped up, but this is really coming back. I think we're in this moment. It's another one of the little points that are out there that we're waiting to see how that's going to emerge as we move into the period, and it's not going to be for a while, where more people are paying attention to this within the framework of the competition between the parties in the general election.
And importantly, I think the other thing we'll be watching in all of this is something just to tie it back, which is how effective or important are these issues relative to the economy, relative to the conduct of the war if it keeps going on. And so these are efforts, and that's why we're watching them, but it's also like there's still these big things out there that, Yeah,
all of this is kind of percolating below the big churn.
Right.
They get the waves going and you get these springs kind of feeding from the bottom, and eventually it all kind of merges together, but I don't know what it's all going to look like. So, we'll resist the temptation to tie it all together. But I think these are all things, we're in this period. I mean, I maybe the takeaway here is we're in this period where there's going to be two temptations, both of which have to be resisted, I think. One is to say, well, yeah, this is a big thing now, but it's not going to matter later. Or to say, see, this is happening, and this is what the election's going to be about in October.
Yeah. Yeah.
And neither of those really work.
And honestly, those are good general lessons for every election, right? Yeah. I mean, there's a certain amount of this thing happened, oh my God, and it's like, hey, take a breath. And then there's also the, exactly what you said. I like that because that's exactly right.
And I think the volatility, you posed that, and I think it helped me kind of put that all together, is the volatility in the national environment right now. I think you can't overestimate.
Yeah, I agree with that.
OECD report came out this morning, it hit the news this morning or overnight, predicting inflation at 4% in the United States.
Yeah.
If that is correct, and we are in an inflationary, and the inflation is actively going up and people are feeling it, and gas prices don't come back down, which I don't see why they could open the Strait of Hormuz. This is not going to happen, but we could open our email tomorrow morning and they could say, hey, nobody knew it, and the U.S. and Iran and Israel have worked everything out.
Yeah, they're best friends.
And the Strait of Hormuz is open, and the price of oil will go down some, but there's already too much, I think, inflationary and price increase pressure and disruption in the system right now. And we're not going to find that in our email tomorrow anyway.
Right.
Whole other topic of how difficult that's going to be to unwind. So all of that going on, and I think to the extent that the economic difficulty stays broadly on the trajectory it's on, where it either gets worse or gets at best only marginally better,
right,
guarantees that dynamic, all the other things we're talking about, particularly the Republican search in Texas for issues on which to mobilize their base and demobilize their opponents, is just going to continue.
Yeah.
Right? We're just going to see more and more of that.
Right.
So with that, thanks for being here. Pretty good week.
Yeah.
Got some things done.
Almost done too.
And we're almost there. So we'll sign out by saying be sure to look for some of the supplemental data, the podcast, some of the things we have. Hasn't been a super data heavy podcast, but lots of stuff you can find at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Go to our front page. Pretty easily navigable links now to find our data resources, recent product, links to this podcast and supplemental material, etc. Thanks as always to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin, operated by a really terrific mixture of UT professional staff and, of course, our extremely talented UT students. So thanks you all. Thanks, Josh, again for being here. Most of all, thanks to you all for listening. You'll find, again, supporting data, much more at our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. We're a little on the bubble for next week, but keep an eye out. We'll pop up in your feed if we manage to get something out. But either way, we'll be back reasonably soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.